She called the sheriff over my cabin parking spot. His arrival changed everything. Daniel Mercer was standing in his kitchen eating soup when his phone rang. He let it go to voicemail. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind where nothing feels urgent, where the only sound in the house is the soft bubbling of something on the stove and the occasional car passing outside. He did not recognize the number. He figured it was a sales call or a wrong number, the kind of thing that resolves itself without effort. He listened to the voicemail 4 minutes later. It was a deputy from the county sheriff's office. The deputy's voice was calm, almost bored, the way people sound when they are relaying information they find mildly unreasonable but are professionally obligated to follow up on. He said there had been a complaint filed regarding a parking encroachment at a cabin property registered in Daniel's name. He said the complainant had requested an official visit. He left his name and a callback number and said there was no urgency, but that Daniel should probably come up to the property soon to sort things out. Daniel stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand, and the voicemail still playing in his ear, and thought about Loretta Vance. He had owned that cabin for 11 years. He bought it in the middle of a difficult stretch, after a divorce that took more from him than just the house in the city. He needed something that was his alone. No shared history, no name on the deed but his own. The cabin sat on a slope in the mountains, surrounded by pine trees and silence, and the particular kind of clean air that makes a person feel like they can breathe properly for the first time in weeks. He drove up every few weekends from May through October and sat on the back steps with coffee and did very little, which was exactly the point. The gravel parking pad beside the cabin was something he had built himself. That was not a casual or exaggerated thing to say. He had actually done it. He had rented a small excavator for a weekend, carved the pad out of the hillside, laid gravel base and then a top layer of larger crushed stone, and tamped it level by hand over the course of 2 full days. His back hurt for a week afterward. He was proud of it in the quiet, unremarkable way a person is proud of something they built with their own hands, and their own money and nobody's help. Loretta Vance had moved into the adjacent cabin lot 8 months ago. Daniel had met her exactly twice. The first time was a brief wave from a distance when he saw her car in the driveway of the next property. The second time was a short conversation at the edge of their lots, where she introduced herself as recently retired, mentioned she had moved up from the city to enjoy some peace and quiet, and then spent 6 minutes telling him about a noise ordinance she felt the cabin association should be enforcing more strictly. Daniel had nodded politely and gone back inside. He had no animosity toward her. She seemed like someone who needed to be in charge of something and had recently run out of things to be in charge of. He understood that feeling, even if her version of it was pointed in an uncomfortable direction. The note appeared on his truck windshield on a weekend in early spring. It was written on a piece of notebook paper in a careful, deliberate hand. It said that she had measured the distance between the property stakes and believed the gravel pad might be encroaching on the shared boundary. It was polite in the way that very pointed things sometimes are. It suggested he might want to verify the location of his property line. Daniel went home, found his original survey documents in the file cabinet where he kept important papers, and checked the coordinates. The pad was his. Not close to the line, not ambiguously near the line. Clearly, measurably, documentably on his property with several feet to spare. He wrote Loretta a short letter. He included a copy of the relevant portion of the survey and noted the coordinates. He was not aggressive about it. He was factual. He dropped it in her mailbox the following weekend and drove home thinking that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Loretta filed an inquiry with the county assessor's office. The county assessor's office reviewed the property records and confirmed what Daniel had already told her. They sent a form letter to both parties stating that the property boundaries were clearly established and that no encroachment had been identified. Daniel received a copy of this letter and put it in his file cabinet next to the survey documents. He assumed that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. Loretta contacted the Mountain Cabin Association, a loose organization of property owners in the area that managed shared road maintenance and sent out occasional newsletters about bear activity and fire safety. The association sent Daniel a standard inquiry form requesting that he confirm the location of his improvements relative to his property boundary. Daniel filled out the form, attached another copy of his survey, and mailed it back. The association confirmed in writing that everything was in order. Daniel added this letter to his growing file and assumed that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. Loretta called the county sheriff's office on a Tuesday and filed a complaint about an ongoing property dispute and possible trespass. She described Daniel's gravel pad as a structure that had been placed without her consent in a disputed area. She requested that a deputy be dispatched to assess the situation. The deputy left the voicemail on a Saturday while Daniel was eating soup. Daniel called back that evening. The deputy, who introduced himself as Cal Reeves, was straightforward and easy to talk to. He explained what the complaint said. He explained that he was required to follow up on filed complaints, but that he had already looked up the county parcel records and that things seemed fairly clear on paper. He said it would still be good for Daniel to come up to the property so they could walk it together and close out the complaint properly. He said Monday worked if Daniel could manage it, or the following weekend if that was easier. Daniel took Monday off work. He made the drive up Sunday evening so he would be there in the morning. He pulled into his gravel pad, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment looking at the pad under his headlights. It was exactly where it had always been. Solid, level, quietly existing on his own land as it had for 11 years. He could see a light on in Loretta's cabin across the way. He did not look at it for long. He went inside, made tea, and sat at the table with his survey documents and the letters from the county assessor and the cabin association spread out in front of him. He had brought them all. He organized them by date and put them in a manila folder. He did not feel angry exactly. He felt something closer to a low, steady disbelief that his quiet gravel pad, which had never bothered anyone, which existed on land he had paid for and maintained for over a decade, had generated this much official paper. He went to bed early and lay awake longer than he wanted to. Deputy Cal Reeves arrived the next morning at 9. He was not what Daniel had pictured from the voicemail. The voice had suggested someone older, heavier, carried by routine. Cal Reeves was in his mid-30s, not tall but built in a way that suggested he had worked physically at some point in his life before the uniform. He had a yellow legal pad under his arm and an unhurried way of moving that Daniel found, against his expectations, immediately reassuring. They shook hands in the driveway. Cal had a direct handshake and looked Daniel in the eye when he introduced himself. "I appreciate you coming up on short notice," Cal said. "I wanted to get this handled," Daniel said. Cal looked at the gravel pad. He looked at the tree line at the edge of the property. He looked back at Daniel and said, "You mind if we walk the line?" They walked it together. Daniel showed him the survey stakes, the orange-tipped metal pins in the ground that marked the legal boundary of his property. Cal crouched down and looked at each one, then stood and looked at the pad, then looked at the space between the pad and the stakes. "There's at least 6 feet from the pad to the line," Cal said. It was not quite a question. 6.5 according to my survey, Daniel said. He handed Cal the manila folder. Cal took it and flipped through the document slowly. He was thorough without being slow for the sake of it. He read what needed to be read and moved on. Daniel watched him and felt the quiet tension of a person waiting to be told that everything they know is correct, which is a strange kind of tension because it should not be tense at all, and yet it always is. Loretta came out onto her porch at some point during this. Daniel noticed her in his peripheral vision. She had her arms crossed and her phone raised, and he could not tell whether she was recording or simply holding the phone the way people do when they want to appear ready to do something. Cal noticed her too. Daniel watched Cal's face do something careful and deliberate, a kind of professional settling, like a man deciding not to react to something he has already formed an opinion about. Cal handed the folder back. "Everything here is in order," he said. "The pad is well within your boundary. I don't see any basis for the complaint." He paused. "I'll document the visit and close it out." Daniel nodded. "I appreciate that." Cal made some notes on his legal pad. He asked a few simple questions about how long Daniel had owned the property, how long the pad had been there, whether there had been any previous disputes. Daniel answered them all. It was all going in the direction of an ending, a clean administrative resolution that would mean nothing more than another letter for his file cabinet. Then Cal stopped writing. He was standing near the rear of Daniel's truck, not looking at it exactly, just in proximity to it, and he paused in the way someone pauses when they notice something in the background of a scene they were not focusing on. He crouched down. He looked at the ground beneath the rear wheel well. "This yours?" he asked. Daniel walked over. On the gravel beneath the truck there was a small dark stain, a drip, another one beside it, the kind of slow accumulation that happens when something has been leaking for a while and not enough at once to notice. Cal touched the edge of the stain with one finger and looked at it. "That's brake fluid," he said. "You drive up the mountain road on this truck this morning." "Last night," Daniel said. Cal stood up and looked at him. Not with alarm, exactly. With the measured attention of someone who has learned to take certain things seriously without making them feel like a crisis in the moment. "You want to get that looked at before you drive back down," he said. Daniel had driven that truck up the mountain road dozens of times. He knew every turn of it. The road climbed steeply for about 4 miles, with switchbacks and drop-offs on the outer edge and no guardrails for long stretches of it. He had driven it in rain and in the early dark of October evenings, and once in a light snow that made everything beautiful and slightly terrifying. He had never once thought about his brakes failing on it because his brakes had never given him any reason to think about them. He thought about them now. Cal was already reaching for his phone. He dialed a number from memory, which told Daniel something about how often he made this particular call. He spoke for about 2 minutes, his voice low and matter-of-fact, and then he held the phone away from his ear and asked Daniel, "You free Monday? My brother-in-law can look at it Monday morning. He's got a shop in town." "I'm already taking the day," Daniel said. He meant it to sound lighter than it came out. Cal confirmed the appointment and hung up. He gave Daniel the address and the name. He said his brother-in-law would take care of him. He said it the way people say things when they actually mean them. Then he shook Daniel's hand again, said the complaint was officially closed, and got in his vehicle and drove away. Daniel stood in his gravel pad, on his land, on ground he had dug out of a hillside with his own hands, and looked at the dark stain on the gravel beneath his truck. Loretta's porch was empty now. She had gone back inside at some point. He had not noticed when. He thought about the road down the mountain. He thought about the switchbacks. He thought about the particular descent on the third curve where the road drops sharply and the outer edge falls away into a long slope of pines and rock. He thought about the fact that a retired woman with a grudge about a gravel pad had sent a deputy to his driveway, and that the deputy had looked at the ground at exactly the right moment, and that the stain was small enough that Daniel had never noticed it himself. He went back inside and called his office to confirm he was taking Monday too. He made coffee and sat at the table and looked out the window at the tree line and the quiet mountain morning and tried to feel the ordinary irritation of a property dispute resolving in his favor. He could not quite locate it. Something else was sitting in the way. He was not sure yet what to call it. He knew he would have driven down that road Sunday night. He always drove back Sunday night. He had plans Monday morning. He would have taken the third switchback at the speed he always took it, which was not fast, but which was fast enough. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and let it warm them. Outside, the mountain was the same as it always was. The pines were still. The gravel pad was exactly where it had always been. Everything looked ordinary from the inside of a window, which is sometimes the most unsettling thing in the world. Pete Reeves ran the kind of garage that felt like it had been there since before the town grew up around it. The building itself was a low, wide structure at the edge of the main road through town, with 2 bay doors and a hand-painted sign above them that said Reeves Auto in letters that had been touched up enough times over the years that they had a slight texture to them, like the word had been said out loud many times and dried into the wood. Inside, it smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee, and something vaguely metallic that was not unpleasant. Tools hung on pegboards in a way that suggested an organized mind behind a worn surface. Pete was Cal's older brother. He was 41, with hands that looked older than his face, and a manner of speaking that was direct without being blunt, the kind of directness that comes from years of telling people things they do not want to hear and learning how to do it without making them feel worse than necessary. He pulled Daniel's truck into the first bay at 8 in the morning and had it up on the lift by 8:15. Daniel sat in the plastic chair beside Pete's small desk and drank the burnt coffee without complaint, because it was offered, and because he was the kind of person who did not refuse something offered in good faith. He watched Pete move under the truck. Pete did not rush. He had a flashlight in one hand and a rag hanging from his back pocket, and he looked at things in the focused, unhurried way of someone who has learned that the truth under a vehicle is always more patient than the person waiting for it. He was under there for about 15 minutes. When he came out, he stood beside the lift and looked at Daniel with an expression that was not alarmed, but was also not casual. "Both rear calipers are seized," Pete said. "And the lines," he paused, "both rear lines, they're corroded through in a couple of places. You've got a slow bleed in one of them and the beginnings of a worse one in the other." Daniel looked at him. "How long has that been going on?" "Hard to say exactly," Pete said. "Months probably, could be longer. This kind of corrosion builds up slow. You wouldn't feel it right away. The front brakes compensate and you don't notice until the rears are basically gone." Daniel absorbed that. How much stopping power was I working with? Pete tilted his head in the way of a man choosing his words carefully. "On flat ground enough. On a steep grade under hard braking, you'd have been relying almost entirely on the front axle." He let that sit for a moment. "The mountain road you drove up, that road's got some serious grade on it." "It does," Daniel said. "You come down at Sunday, you probably would have been okay. One more trip down, maybe 2, depending on the situation. But sooner or later on a road like that, you'd need everything working at once." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Daniel looked at the calendar on Pete's wall. It was the kind given out free at farm supply stores, with photographs of local landscapes at the top of each month. The current month showed a wide shot of a river valley in early spring, all pale green and gray-blue water. He looked at it without really seeing it. He was doing arithmetic in his head, the kind of arithmetic that has nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with probability. He had driven that road the weekend before. He had brought his daughter. He had not mentioned that to Pete, and he did not mention it now. He looked at the calendar and kept that information to himself, because there is a kind of thought that, once spoken aloud, becomes too heavy to carry comfortably in a normal conversation. And he was in a normal conversation, in a garage, on a Monday morning, and he wanted to keep it that way. His daughter's name was Claire. She was 17. She had sat in the passenger seat for the whole drive up, her feet on the dashboard despite his repeated mild objections, listening to music through her earphones and occasionally pointing out deer or an interesting cloud formation. She had eaten most of the road snacks he had packed. She had fallen asleep on the way back down the mountain in the late afternoon, her head against the window, completely at ease. He thought about the third switchback. He thought about the outer edge of the road. He thought about the long slope of pines below it, and the particular quality of quiet that lives in a forest when it is receiving something it did not expect. He looked away from the calendar. "How long to fix it?" he asked. "I can have the parts here by this afternoon," Pete said. "Do the work tomorrow morning. You can pick it up Tuesday around noon." "That works," Daniel said. Pete wrote the estimate on a yellow work order sheet and slid it across the desk. Daniel looked at the number. It was less than he had expected, meaningfully less, the kind of number that makes a person look up from the paper. "Is this right?" he asked. Pete shrugged with one shoulder, the way people do when they are being generous and do not want to make a thing of it. "Cal mentioned the situation," he said. "Said you'd had a rough few weeks with the neighbor business. Said you were a decent guy." He picked up his pen and clicked it once. "I factor that in." Daniel looked at him for a moment. He thought about Loretta Vance. He thought about her notebook paper note on his windshield, her calls to the assessor's office and the cabin association and the sheriff's department. He thought about the sequence of events that had deposited him in this plastic chair in this garage on this particular Monday morning. He thought about the word factor, about the idea that a woman's pettiness had, by a route too strange to have been planned, put him in front of a mechanic who was charging him less than fair price to repair the thing that would have, on some specific future curve of a mountain road, mattered more than he wanted to think about. He could not organize this into a feeling he recognized. It was not gratitude toward Loretta. It was not forgiveness. It was something more unwieldy than either of those, a kind of off-balance recognition that the world sometimes works in directions you cannot predict or account for, and that sometimes the thing pointed at you misses and hits something behind you that needed hitting. He signed the work order. Pete brought him a second cup of the burnt coffee without asking, and Daniel drank it, and they talked for a while about the mountain road and the best time of year to be up there, and whether the winter had been as bad as people said. It was the kind of conversation that costs nothing and means more than it seems to, and Daniel let himself settle into it. He rented a car from the small agency 2 blocks away and drove back to the city. He had a folder of surveys and official letters on the seat beside him, and a receipt for a brake job in his jacket pocket, and a daughter who did not know how close she had been to a different kind of Monday. He drove the whole way at exactly the speed limit, which was not something he always did. When he got home, he put the manila folder in his file cabinet and put the receipt in the folder, and then he sat at his kitchen table, which was where he seemed to do his heaviest thinking, and he looked at the wall for a while without seeing it. Claire called that evening to ask if they were going back up to the cabin the following weekend. She had left a sweatshirt there. She said it like it was a simple logistical question, which it was from where she was standing. He told her he would let her know. He asked how school was. She talked for 11 minutes about something that had happened in her history class, and he listened to every word of it, and when they hung up, he sat with the phone in his hand for a while longer. He thought about Pete saying the front brakes compensate, and you don't notice. He thought about how many things in a person's life are working in quiet correction for failures that have not yet announced themselves. He thought about how little you know about the ground beneath you until someone crouches down and points at a stain. It was not a comfortable thought, but it was an honest one, and he had learned over the years to prefer honest discomfort to comfortable ignorance. He went to bed. He slept better than he expected to. 3 weeks after the deputy's visit, Daniel drove back up to the cabin on a Saturday morning with a licensed surveyor in a separate vehicle behind him. The surveyor's name was Greta Wallace. She had been doing this work in the county for over 2 decades, and she had the particular manner of someone who has spent years navigating disputes between neighbors. She was precise without being cold, thorough without being slow, and she answered questions directly, which Daniel appreciated. He was not there because he doubted his original survey. He knew what his documents said. He had known for months. He was there because he had made a decision, a clear and deliberate one, that he wanted everything about his property boundary to be not just correct but visible, documented, witnessed, photographed. He wanted the stakes to be bright orange and unmistakable, the kind of thing a person could not look at and claim they had not seen. He also had a feeling, the kind that lives in the back of the mind and does not get louder until it is addressed, that the situation with Loretta was not finished, that the closed complaint was an administrative closure and not the same thing as a resolution. Greta drove her truck around the perimeter of his lot with a precision that made the process look effortless, though Daniel knew from the estimate she had quoted him that effortless was not the right word for it. She checked the existing survey stakes and then set new ones, bright orange, hammered firmly. She shot photographs at every corner and along the rear boundary. She had a small device that gave her GPS coordinates to within a few inches, and she read each one aloud and wrote it in her field notebook without pausing. When she reached the rear of the property, she slowed down. Not in a dramatic way, just the kind of slowing that a professional does when something requires more attention than the previous step. She checked one stake and then checked it again. She looked at the tree line and then back toward the neighboring property. She took 2 photographs in quick succession. Daniel watched her. "Something wrong?" he asked. "Not with your boundary," she said. She finished what she was writing and then looked up. "The fence on the neighboring lot, the one that went in last spring." Daniel looked at the fence. It was a simple wood post and wire fence that Loretta had installed along what she apparently believed was the shared boundary. It ran for about 60 feet along the back of both properties. "It's 11 inches over your line," Greta said. She said it the way she said everything, directly and without editorializing, but her eyes had the look of a person who has delivered this kind of news enough times to know what usually follows it. 11 inches. Not a dramatic amount in absolute terms, not enough to notice without a proper instrument, but across 60 feet of fence line it was enough to matter and more than enough to be real. Daniel looked at the fence. He looked at Greta. She was already taking more photographs, doing her job, staying on her side of the moment. He thought about what he held in his hands now, a licensed survey, official documentation, photographs with GPS timestamps. A fence that was unambiguously on his property, built there by the same woman who had called the county sheriff on him for a gravel pad that was not on her property by 6.5 feet. The irony was not subtle. He noticed it the way a person notices a sudden change in the weather, a shift that is too complete and too abrupt to ignore. He had every legal right to require the fence's removal. He could contact the county. He could send a certified letter. He could call Cal Reeves, whose number was still in his phone, and report an actual encroachment instead of an imagined one. He could do all of the things that Loretta had done to him, and unlike her, he would be right when he did them. He stood at the edge of his property for a long moment, looking at the fence. Then he asked Greta how long the documentation process would take to finalize. "I'll have the full report to you by Thursday," she said. "Thank you," he said. He looked at the fence one more time. "I'll be in touch about next steps." He walked back to his cabin. He sat on the back steps where he had sat for 11 years with his morning coffee, the place that was his alone, no shared history, no other name on the deed. He looked out at the pines. He thought about going to Loretta's door, not to fight, not to match what she had done with the same energy, but because there was something that needed to be said, and he was not the kind of person who let important things go unsaid simply because saying them was uncomfortable. He thought about what that conversation would need to be. He thought about what he would lead with and what he would hold back and what, if anything, he expected her to say in return. He sat there until his coffee was cold, and the light through the trees had shifted from morning into midday. And then he stood up, washed his cup in the sink, and walked across the gap between the properties. Loretta's door was solid wood, painted a dark green that had faded to something closer to gray at the edges. He knocked twice. He heard movement inside. There was a pause that was slightly longer than a normal pause, the kind where a person is deciding something. The door opened. Loretta looked at him the way he had expected her to look at him. Her phone was already in her hand. Her expression was the expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment, who had imagined it arriving and prepared for the version of it where she was the one with the grievance and the authority, and the right to be standing her ground. She did not yet know she was in a different version. Daniel did not raise his voice. He had not planned to, and the calm that had settled into him over the past 3 weeks held without effort. He told her what Greta had found. He told her the fence was 11 inches over his line, that he had the documentation, the photographs, and the GPS coordinates to prove it. He told her this not as a threat and not as a victory lap, but as a simple piece of information she needed to have. He watched her expression move. The rehearsed readiness in her face shifted as the information landed, and she tried to fit it into the version of the situation she had been carrying. Then he told her about the brake lines. He told it plainly. He told her that the deputy she had called had noticed a drip of brake fluid beneath his truck while wrapping up a property visit that had found absolutely nothing wrong with Daniel's parking pad. He told her that the deputy had called his brother-in-law, who ran a garage in town, and that the brother-in-law had found both rear brake lines corroded through. He told her that on the mountain road, under hard braking on a steep grade, this would have been a serious problem. He did not specify how serious. He trusted her to do that arithmetic herself. He told her his daughter had been in the truck the weekend before. He told her all of this without accusation and without cruelty, because neither of those things would have served what he was actually trying to do, which was to make her understand the full shape of what had happened, the full shape of what her phone call had put into motion, and what it had accidentally, impossibly, redirected. Loretta said nothing for a long time. Not the aggressive silence of someone preparing a counter-argument, a different kind of silence, the kind that comes when a person is recalculating something fundamental. Daniel did not fill the silence. He had said what he came to say. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked past her at the interior of her cabin, which was tidy and full of framed photographs, and the particular furnishings of someone who had been building a life somewhere else for a long time, and moved those things here in search of something quieter. He understood that too, in his way. "The fence needs to come down," he said. "I'd rather you handle it than go through the county, but I will go through the county if that's what's needed." He said it simply, without heat. Then he walked back across the gap between the properties and went inside his cabin. He made a fresh cup of coffee and sat at the table and did not look out the window toward Loretta's cabin. He looked at his hands around the mug. He thought about all the things that had begun with a note on notebook paper left under a windshield wiper, and all the places those things had led. He thought about the word encroachment, about how it had been the word pointed at him, and how it had turned out in the end to belong somewhere else entirely. He finished his coffee. He washed the mug. He went outside and sat on the back steps and listened to the pines. The fence came down in the first week of the following month. Daniel did not see it happen. He was in the city during the week, and the work was done on a Tuesday, which was not a day he would ordinarily be at the cabin. He found out because he drove up the following Saturday and the fence was simply gone, not relocated to the correct line, removed entirely. The post holes were still visible in the ground, small circles of raw earth, the only evidence that the fence had ever been there. He stood at the edge of his property and looked at where it had been for a while. He found out later, through the kind of indirect small-town information that travels without any deliberate effort, that Loretta had hired Pete Reeves' nephew to take it down. The nephew's name was Gary, and he did property work and light construction around the mountain area, and he was apparently well known enough that Loretta had found him without any particular difficulty. Which meant she had, at some point, been in contact with Pete Reeves' circle. Which meant the distance between the woman who had called the sheriff on Daniel and the family of the man who had saved Daniel's brake lines was approximately one phone call, which meant the mountain was smaller than either of them had ever acted like it was. Daniel thought about that for a few minutes. He decided it was not surprising exactly, because small communities work this way, everything connected to everything else by short chains of mutual acquaintance, every person no more than 2 names away from every other person. What surprised him was the particular loop of it, that the connection ran through Pete, that Loretta had found her way, even in the small act of hiring someone to fix what she had caused, back into that same small orbit. He did not know what it meant. He was not sure it meant anything beyond the simple geometry of a small place. He walked back to his cabin and stood on the back steps and looked out at the pines and the particular late morning light that came through them this time of year, gold and clean, and moving slightly with the wind. This was what he had bought the cabin for. This exact view from this exact step. 11 years of it. It had never looked different, and it had never stopped being the thing he drove up here to see. He thought about Loretta, which was something he had been doing with a regularity that surprised him, not with anger. He had expected the anger to be the dominant thing, given the shape of what she had done. The notes, the calls, the complaint, the months of low-grade official interference in his quiet life. He had expected that, once the surveyor confirmed the fence, and once the brake job was done, and once the complaint was formally closed, anger would be the feeling that settled in for the long stay. It had not. Something more complicated had taken up that space instead. He could not find a clean name for it. It was not gratitude toward her. That would require believing she had intended something good, and she had not. She had intended to be right about a property line, and she had been wrong, and everything that followed had been a consequence of her unwillingness to accept that she was wrong. There was nothing in that chain of events that deserved the word gratitude. But there was something, a kind of tilted acknowledgement that the world had used her, without her knowledge or consent, as the instrument of something she would never have chosen to be. She had sent a deputy to Daniel's property to embarrass him, to validate a complaint that had no basis, to insert official pressure into a situation where he held every right. Instead, she had sent someone who crouched beside a truck and noticed a stain. Daniel had thought about this often enough in the weeks since that it had stopped feeling remarkable and started feeling like a fact. A strange fact, the kind that does not sort neatly into any category, but a fact nonetheless. He had not spoken to Loretta since the conversation at her door. He had seen her once at a distance when they both happened to be outside on the same morning, and their sight lines crossed briefly before she went back inside. She had not waved. He had not waved. There was no hostility in it, or not much. It was the careful, practiced non-engagement of 2 people who have said what needed to be said and are letting that be sufficient. He was not going to become her friend. That was not something he wanted, and he suspected it was not something she wanted either. People who have occupied opposing corners of a dispute rarely find their way to the same room without the structure of the dispute to give them context. Without it, there is just 2 people who know something uncomfortable about each other, and that is not the foundation of much. He had expected closure to feel like an absence, like the removal of a weight. He had expected that when the fence came down and the paperwork was finalized and the truck was running properly, he would feel the clear, light sensation of something completed. It did not feel like that. It felt more like carrying a stone in a coat pocket, not heavy enough to slow him down, not sharp enough to cause real discomfort, but always present. A weight with a specific origin. A stone that had been put there by a chain of events too strange to have been engineered and too precise to feel entirely random. Deputy Cal Reeves got a thank you card in the mail at the end of that month. Daniel wrote it at the kitchen table in the city, on a plain card he bought at a grocery store, and he tried to say what needed to be said without over-explaining it. He thanked Cal for his professionalism during the visit. He mentioned that the brake work had been done, and that the truck was in good order. He thanked him specifically for noticing what he noticed, and for making the call he made, and for doing all of it without any obligation beyond decency. He put a gas station gift card inside, because he could not think of a better way to attach a small tangible thing to an intangible debt. 3 days after he mailed it, he got a text message from a number he did not immediately recognize. It said, "Glad you made it home." He was sitting at his kitchen table when it arrived. He recognized the number as Cal's after a moment and looked at the message for longer than its 7 words would seem to require. Glad you made it home. Simple words. The kind of thing a person says when they mean exactly what the words say and nothing more and nothing less. Daniel thought about the word home and what it meant to him. He thought about the cabin on the mountain and the gravel pad and the 11 years of Saturday mornings on the back steps with coffee. He thought about the city apartment where he sat at this table and did his heaviest thinking. He thought about Claire's sweatshirt hanging on the hook inside the cabin door where she had left it. He thought about roads and what it means to arrive at the end of one. He thought about the fact that there had been a version of that mountain road, a version that existed in the space of probability, and could have become real on any one of several recent weekends, in which the third switchback had been the last thing he saw, in which the slope of pines below the road had been the last thing he moved toward. He had thought about this version many times since Pete had explained the brake lines to him, and each time he thought about it, it settled into him a little differently. Not with panic, not with the dramatic rearrangement of values that people describe after near misses, more quietly than that, more like a recalibration so subtle that it had no obvious symptoms, but that changed the way things felt when he looked at them. He looked at his kitchen. He looked at the window and the street outside it, and the ordinary Tuesday afternoon happening beyond the glass. He typed back, "Thank you for looking down." He did not hear from Cal again after that, which was appropriate. They were not people who would become friends. They had shared a specific moment in a specific driveway and done each other a good turn, and that was complete in itself. Some things are complete without becoming more. The truck ran well after Pete's work, better than it had run in some time, now that Daniel paid attention to how it felt. He drove it for 4 more years. He drove it up the mountain road dozens of times in those years, in the rain and in the early fall mornings, and once in a light snow. He always looked at the third switchback when he came to it. He did not make a thing of it. He just noticed it, the way a person notices a place that once held something important. Claire got her driver's license the following spring and asked twice if she could borrow the truck. He said yes both times, and both times he watched her drive away and stood in the street for a moment after she turned the corner. That was a different kind of feeling from anything connected to Loretta or the brake lines or the mountain road. That was just being a father, the ongoing quiet fear that is the price of loving someone who moves through the world in their own body without your supervision. He repainted the gravel pad the following summer, not because it needed it, but because he wanted to. He added a second layer of crushed stone and leveled the surface, and spent a Saturday on his knees with a tamper making it solid and right. His back hurt for a week afterward. He was, again, quietly proud. The survey documents and the official letters and the photographs were in his file cabinet, in a folder behind the original deed. He had not looked at them in months. He knew they were there, which was the point of keeping them. Some documents exist to be never needed, which is exactly what makes keeping them worthwhile. He never filed anything against Loretta for the fence. He thought about it once briefly and then decided against it. The fence was gone. The documentation existed. He had what he needed to act if anything further happened, and nothing further happened, and the documentation stayed in the folder, and the folder stayed in the drawer. He did not know what Loretta made of the conversation at her door. He did not know whether it had changed anything for her, whether the information about the brake lines had shifted something in the way she understood the sequence of events, whether she had spent any time since in the kind of recalculation he had seen move across her face in that doorway. He suspected that people are not often transformed by a single conversation, even an important one. He suspected she had her version of the story, and he had his, and the truth was somewhere in the space between them, which is where most truths live. He did not need her to have a particular version. He did not need anything from her. That, more than anything else, was the thing that had finally settled in him. He had needed the fence down, and it was down. He had needed the complaint closed, and it was closed. He had needed his truck safe, and it was safe. Everything else was just the strange, irreducible story of how those things had come to be, and that story did not require a tidy ending to be true. There is a kind of peace that does not look like peace from the outside, that does not come with resolution or reconciliation or the feeling of a weight lifted. It comes instead with the quiet understanding that some things happened the way they happened, and you are standing on the other side of them, and that is enough. Daniel Mercer drove up to his cabin on the last weekend of October. He parked on his gravel pad. He went inside and made coffee and took it out to the back steps and sat there in the cold, clean air while the pines moved slowly in the wind, and the morning light came through them the way it always had. He thought about nothing in particular. He finished his coffee. He went back inside.